looking back on the books that were incredibly formative to me right in the lead up to when I started writing this book, it's like Donna Tartt's The Secret History. It's Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter, my old professor Paula Farge's The Night Ocean, all these books where there are huge mysteries that are being untangled, but it isn't necessarily a detective sort of on the search for the killer.
I'm Michael Tamblyn. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Keziah Weir, winner of the 2024 Kobo Emerging Writer Prize in the category of mystery for her novel, The Mythmakers. Let's set the stage. It's the story of a writer who's hit a very rough patch in every aspect of her life. But then a short story appears by an author she met some time ago, and it's about her and the moment that they met. She hears that this is a part of a larger book and also learns that the author is deceased. This sets her on a path of investigation into the author, his widow, and ultimately into the heart of storytelling itself. Keziah Weir, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
The Emerging Writers Prize is for first books, but this is by no means the start of your writing career. You've built a very robust body of work in magazines and long and short form journalism. And so I want to talk about what the magazine writing life looks like, and then how that changes when you decide to fit book writing into it.
Yeah, so interestingly, I started this book right around when I started my career in magazines. I had been working at a magazine for maybe 6 or 9 months, all the way back in sort of 2013, 2014. So this book took a long time to germinate. But the magazine trajectory was a pretty standard, I got a very entry-level job at Elle magazine, almost my first job out of college, and worked there as an editorial assistant for a couple of years. Then I started working as an assistant editor. I was very fortunate that I was working with a group of people, primarily women, who were very encouraging of the fact that I wanted to be writing and that I wanted particularly to be writing about books and authors. So I had sort of the incredible opportunity to, from a very, early start, be interviewing authors of books that I loved. And then from there, my writing has sort of ballooned out. I then moved over to Vanity Fair magazine about 6 years ago, and I write and edit features, and then some of the shorter pieces there. So it's been an exciting run, but the whole time I was also working on fiction writing, which sort of I sneak in, in the mornings and evenings and weekends.
And so has this book had a long evolution, or just the slow process of putting it together? Does it look like what it looked like, kind of in your mind when you first started off on this journey?
Yeah, so it really started off with Sal and Moira. They arrived almost together, the idea of this younger woman who met an older woman, and the relationship that they had together. Moira, in this form and in all forms, has always been a physicist, and but Martin didn't come until maybe a year into sort of futzing around with the story, and he actually showed up after I had sort of a similar interaction with a screenwriter at a party when I was maybe 22 or 23. And I just had an interesting conversation with an interesting man, never met him again.
This we want to get into.
Sure.
Because there's all kinds of good stuff in here. So first, introduce us to Sal and where she is in her life as the book gets started.
Yeah, so Sal is a journalist in her sort of mid-late 20s, And she has, as you mentioned, sort of hit some stumbling blocks in her career. She recently wrote a profile of a playwright who she then finds, she's quite taken by him. She's charmed and, writes a very laudatory piece and then finds out that he has sort of hidden or she has missed this whole aspect of his personality and identity. So she's very embarrassed by that. And then when she finds this short story that she realizes has all of these similarities to her own life and to this interaction that she had with an author who she had met, some years earlier, in her early 20s, she'd had this very intense, sort of fun interaction with him at a literary party at the New York Public Library. And then over the years, sort of thought about him, thought maybe she should get in touch with him, didn't ever do that. And then this story shows up and it seems to be written about her and about their interaction. And she's obviously very excited about this. As a writer, you're sort of always looking for a hook. You're always looking for a story. What better story than a story about yourself? And then she finds out that the author has died. And and that author is Martin Keller. And so instead, she sort of turns her attention to his widow, Moira.
As you hinted at, this is entirely a work of fiction, and yet that crucial scene at its core is something that you took from your life. So tell me a little bit about the encounter that you had while attending a reading with like an older mysterious man.
Yeah, it was. I had a really wonderful professor in college who knew, in the months after graduation that I was interested in sort of pursuing a literary life. And so he had invited me to a reading at the New York Public Library. And then afterwards, there was a party, and I didn't know anyone, besides my professor who was sort of off talking to somebody else. And I was milling around. I'm not great in sort of party social situations where I don't know people. I find that very anxiety producing. So I was probably, maybe having some wine and eating some snacks and looking out of place. And this man just came over and we just started talking. He was, I think, in his probably 70s at that point. And I don't know how long we talked, but he was very flattering and encouraging and interesting and said all kinds of sort of wonderful soundbite things to me. The thing that stuck was that he said, and I stole this from him verbatim for the book, but he said, "Your life is going to only become more beautiful than it is now," which is just like, I mean, if someone says something like that to you, it's just wonderful.
Everybody needs somebody to show up like that and just give
I
them
know.
give them that stuff.
I know. And so and I didn't know who this person was. And then afterwards, my professor came up and was like, "Did you know that was, I think it's okay to say, it was Hampton Fancher, who was the screenwriter for Blade Runner." And I, was like, cool, but I was 22 and sort of went off on my way. And, he went off on his. And, but I thought I was just sort of interested in that interaction and the way that it made me feel, the way that I felt so sort of chosen in that moment, in a moment that I felt very out of place. And I thought, what if that had been a novelist? What if it had been a sort of semi-famous novelist who was doing the thing that I wanted to be doing? And then, what would happen if that young woman's career was sort of tanking when she was reintroduced to this memory of this person?
And so let's talk about the tanking career for a second, because you are a senior editor at Vanity Fair. You interview a lot of people as a part of that job. And so I imagine you know how this kind of thing could look or feel from a number of different angles. Was what happened to Sal an experiment in imagining what's the worst thing that can happen to an author when who gets it wrong?
It was. I think that everybody who writes about other people has an anxiety about whether they're getting them right and whether they are seeing the full picture. When I was writing the book, there had been a few instances of journalists being outright duped by their subjects, and uh, you know, having people telling just outright lies. And so when I started writing the story, that was in my mind. And it's kind of nice to put all your anxieties on the page. And
So you can share them with everybody. Like
so
why?
you can
Why?
share them with
Yeah.
everybody. Exactly. What better thing to do with your deepest fears? And then it actually, a similar thing ended up happening to me in sort of a different context. I wrote a short profile of an author. It was a quick hit for a newspaper. And then a year later, another journalist wrote a very substantial profile of this person and sort of turned up all these uh, more complicated facets of their life. So that definitely uh, made it easier for me to write about the feelings that are associated with that.
One of the other parts of Sal's life that's going wrong is her partner Hugh and her are growing quite distant, even at the beginning of the book. And part of that is that she sees Hugh as having given up his art to earn a living. And Hugh's earnings keep them comfortably housed in Brooklyn while she, pursues her career. Is that a conflict that you were interested in digging into? Like that's kind of one of the classic art versus make a living, conundrums that we face if you're in a creative field.
Yeah, I am totally interested in that. And it's something, obviously, my day job, thankfully, is something that's incredibly creatively gratifying. But for a lot of people, it can't be for whatever reason. And no matter what you're doing, no matter how invested I am in either fiction or journalism, there's always a pull between the two. There's always sort of this, there are only so many hours in the day. And uh, and then it's always sort of nice to split those, again, anxieties. This it's not a hugely anxious book, but I have managed to put some of my big ones there, to split concerns into two different characters. And so for Sal to have sort of completely decided that she's only going to be working on the thing that she most wants to do in her, most her creative drive, and then for Hugh to have given up his painting so that he can uh, make money and make sure that, that they are living in a way that works for both of them. There's of course going to be tensions that arise from that, and I think there are very interesting conversations that can come out of that.
Well, and it's very thoughtful because as you are working through your own anxieties on the page, it also allows all of us with underused fine arts degrees to to work through that ourselves. So thank you for that. Um,
Are you speaking from personal experience?
I'm not going to say it's too painful. So this is also, in a way, a book about, I don't know, what you could call them, literary men TM, like that particular almost archetype. And it's said of Martin Keller, who the character whose short story is at the heart of this mystery, and it is a mystery, and we're going to get to the mystery part in a sec, that he, quote, he wants a recognition for work he didn't do. He wants his writing to prove to the world once and for all that he is a good person, end quote. And this is such an incisive observation, but it also feels like it could be applied broadly. Is that a character trait that you've seen in the world too many times to not want to put in here and put a label to?
Yeah, I think, I have been incredibly fortunate that I have had a lot of literary men in my life who have been really wonderful. And I think this doesn't only apply to male authors, but I think that I was sort of steeped in this tradition of the great man writing. And so I think I had a lot to draw from. Um, and then at the same time, I think that there are ongoing conversations about, whether what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a good artist, what it means to be a bad person and a good artist, whatever a bad and good mean in that sense. But the question of art and life and how that Venn diagram intersects just is always going to be interesting to me. And I think, to anybody who reads books, it is very hard to completely block out the person who has written them. So it always sort of comes into play.
We've been talking a lot about careers and relationships and literary men and disastrous things that can happen to journalists, but this is a mystery. You even won an award for being a mystery. So I want to talk a bit about the mysterious aspects of the myth makers. And I think it's significant to talk about how this book operates as a mystery. Like this, the genre is presently so dominated by police procedurals and cozy mysteries, and it begins with a corpse, or you get one like soon after, and so some readers may not realize that there's this rich tradition of books that are mysterious in their nature, as opposed to kind of
Yeah.
mysterious as a problem solving thing. So talk to me a bit about the mystery that sits at the heart of this, and how you wrapped this book around that.
I think, well, so
And it's
to
tricky
sort of
because it's hard to talk about the mystery without unraveling it too much. I understand.
exactly, but to sort of talk about the first thing about the idea of this being in a tradition of other books, it is so interesting. It's when you're writing something, I think most of the time I have no idea sort of how it's going to be read, how it's going to be taken. So it has been so interesting thinking about this book because as it started finding its readers, people kept calling it a literary mystery, and it's just not something that I ever would have thought to sort of categorize it as. But then, of course, looking back on the books that were incredibly formative to me right in the lead up to when I started writing this book, it's like Donna Tartt's The Secret History, it's Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter, my old professor Paul Lafarge's The Night Ocean, all these books where there are huge mysteries that are being untangled, but it isn't necessarily a detective sort of on the search for the killer. Um, so this mystery, I think that there are a couple levels of mystery. One is, why did this guy write this story about a woman who he had such a passing interaction with? Um, and then after that, there's sort of a whole mystery about who this person is, what his relationship with his wife is. His wife is Moira, is sort of a cipher in the beginning. She is holding Sal at arm's length. Sal's very interested in figuring out who she is, who this woman is, who this man who was obsessed with Sal chose to spend his life with. And there are a few more that unfurl from there, but so I'm not sure which you want to get into and which we want to leave for readers. But
Oh, I think we leave almost all of them, because you're right. Like once you pull one thread, this whole thing starts to kind of unravel it before you. But I'm interested in whether at the time that you started, you felt like you were writing a mystery. Was this a book that had that piece of the unknown at the core, and was that the intent when you kicked it off?
I think that the way that I write is very much writing into an unknown. I had no idea where this was going. I didn't know what Martin's story was going to be. I didn't know what was going to be. Um, there's a character who we won't talk about, but who sort of shows up partway through. And I had no idea that she was going to show up. So, in a sense, all writing fiction feels like a mystery to me. And I do think that, so, my influences are these books that um, are maybe cross genre or that sort of play with constructions of genre. I did my undergraduate thesis on like a literature thesis on Nabokov, and all of those books, Lolita is complete. It's totally a mystery, and so I think that even if I didn't know exactly what I was doing, there's so much that I think you find out about your own work in retrospect. Then yeah, of course I was writing a mystery into this, and I just maybe didn't realize it until 10 years in.
You um you talked about some of the influences that surround this book. We talked about Philip Roth. We've talked about Nabokov. Was there was there any particular book or any particular author that you either kind of held out as being someone that you wanted to keep in mind as you were starting this, or conversely, there are those books that you try to like, okay, I'm not looking at that because if I do, it's like it's the medicine's too strong and I don't want it to get in here.
Yeah, I think so. I'm somebody who does read a lot of fiction while I'm writing fiction. It just feeds it. I interviewed Marlon James years ago, and he said something that I just loved. Um, I asked him if he read fiction while he was writing fiction, and if he was worried about influences, and he said, I'll paraphrase him, but basically, like, yes, of course I read it. And in terms of influences, one can only hope. You can only hope to be influenced by these books that you love. So I loved that. But yes, I think that there definitely are some that you sort of have to step away from. Philip Roth was just a huge sort of he was somebody who I was thinking about a lot as a person, as a writer, his fiction while I was writing this book. And there were definitely times where it was like, okay, I cannot reread The Human Stain again. Nabokov is somebody who I think I could read over and over again. I'm never going to, I couldn't ever hope to write a Nabokov novel, and so it doesn't feel, not that I think I could write a Roth novel, but it doesn't feel like it's going to permeate too heavily. And I've just started reading poetry more, and that feels like a sort of helpful palate cleanser. But definitely, yeah, The Human Stain and The Ghostwriter, and then Nicole Krauss's novels too. The way that those fit together in these beautiful jigsaw puzzles. Zadie Smith. I think there were so many feeder influences for this book.
Well, and speaking on a podcast run by booksellers, you have now completely fulfilled your responsibility to get lots of other books mentioned here that we then get to go and introduce people to. So thank you
Yeah.
very much for that. That was very gracious. Uh, you you recently won the 2024 Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writers Prize for Mystery, and I wanted to ask you, away from the podium, was it surprising to see the myth makers nominated for and winning a prize for mystery writing?
I mean, I think it was surprising and wonderful for it to be nominated and win a prize for anything. I think it's just incredibly, yeah, I sort of don't have words for what that feels like. Um, and then, for winning a mystery again, I think it Danny Shapiro is one of the incredibly gracious authors who agreed to blurb the novel, and I think she was maybe one of the first people who called it a literary mystery. And so it, yeah, I mean, I think I really I don't even know how to say sort of how great and thankful I am for that because it's yeah, it's just like a lovely thing. Again, it sort of gets at that feeling that Sal is looking for in the novel is to be chosen by somebody else. I think that's something that we are all, you know, I hope that I never lose the wonderful feeling that I get when you put your work into the world and somebody says that they like it. It's a very basic, it fulfills a very basic and very strong need, I think.
Because we run this prize, and then because we get to talk to so many people who have just had their first book out or have recently released their first book, it means we get to talk a lot about second books. And so I'm interested in where you are in that process of either thinking about a next book or starting to initiate a next book and what that's looking like for you right now.
Yes, so I started writing a book maybe I guess it's 4 years ago now that I every time the myth makers went into a new phase where I wasn't touching it, you know, at first it went to my agents for them to do their read, then it goes to the editor. They, you know, do various reads and edits, and there's sort of these long stretches where you can't really be futzing with the novel. So during those stretches, I did start writing something new, and then while while working on that, then I started actually working on another. So I'm sort of juggling two projects right now. One takes place in San Francisco, which is one, you know, I was born there and I lived there for a certain amount of time. And then the other takes place on an island. I spent my high school years on a little island off the coast of British Columbia called Salt Spring. And I don't know if you've spent time in the Gulf Islands, but they are beautiful.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, so I lived there for 4 years, and so this other novel takes place on sort of a similar setting. And I feel sort of like every time I hit a block with one, that I am able to switch over to the other. But it's not a very uh, it's not maybe the best use of time to be sort of juggling two projects when time is already limited to be working on those. But I'm really enjoying both, so I'm gonna run with it.
But I am interested in that question of time and pace as you move from first novel, which can often have such a long gestation process,
Yeah.
to having finished one, knowing you can write one, and then starting on a subsequent one. Does that how does that change the mindset that you're going into as you're starting it? How does that change the rate at which you write within it?
I mean, the first book nobody was asking for. You know, I didn't have an agent. I was sort of just working on it alone in my apartment, and it was a total secret. Um, Now, and I even during that time, people would ask me, you know, because I was interviewing authors all the time, people would ask if I was working on my own fiction, and I would just lie and say no because it just felt so embarrassing to even talk about. And now the jig is up, and so it's much harder to keep that. You know, I can't keep it secret, which is a very fortunate position to be in. But I now also have literary agents who are interested in when the next manuscript is going to hit their desk. And so I do have sort of more of a sense of um, external pull than I did the first time. But either, you know, both, I'm sort of experiencing the same thing that I did the first book, where it's just taking as long as it's going to take. I can't, you know, I have done things to try to expedite the process. I don't think it's going to take as long as the first novel did, just because I think so much of that was really, I hadn't ever written that anything that long before. It was just sort of figuring out how the machinery of a novel works, and I I know that I can do that now, although it does sort of feel like you're reinventing the wheel every time, and maybe that's just the way it's going to go. But it it does feel nice to remember that I have done it once, and I even once in a while when I'm feeling most demoralized will go back and look at old drafts of the myth makers and see just how sort of disparate and wild it was even a few years into it. So I like know that even if it feels a little bit disjointed and nutty now, it is going to come together if I keep chipping away. At least
It's
that is the hope.
it's interesting that you go back to old drafts, because I would be going to the actual printed book that has a cover on it and your name. I'd be pressing it against my face like this.
Yeah,
This is a real thing that I can bring into the world.
yeah. It's sort of like looking at, I also like to look at novels by authors who I love, their early work and see, what they were working on. And there's nothing that I love more. I was just talking to a friend. There's nothing that I love more than finding out that a novelist who I love didn't publish their first novel until, they were 35, 45, 50, like, and then, there's nothing more heartening to me than that. So it's sort of, I'm doing that version of like, oh, Joan Didion was 35 when she, wrote her first book that did well. Like I got a few more years. So,
Yes,
um,
please give me
yeah,
all the
yeah,
late bloomer stories,
yeah,
that are possible.
exactly.
Keziah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this lovely conversation. And thank you again for the prize. It was such a it was just wonderful to be around so many people who love books and make books. And it felt very special.
No,
So
the
thank you.
pleasure was all ours. I have been speaking with Keziah Weir, author of The Mythmakers. Find it and the other books that we've spoken about at kobo.com/emerging writer prize, or click the link in the show notes. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode, and if you enjoyed this one, tell somebody that perhaps you've written secretly about. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.